I have written another article for New Eastern Outlook. It is titled Trump's Threats Against Iran Exposes U.S. Continuity of Agenda. And for those who have been following my work since the presidential elections in the United States in 2024, and as soon as Donald Trump won the election, and before he even stepped foot into office, I warned everyone that this is exactly what was going to happen. Continuity of agenda in every single regard. That is exactly what we are seeing, including in regards to Iran. So, as always, I'm going to read through this article. I will show you the sources that I cited, and I will add in additional information when and if necessary. And in the video description below, you will find all of the links to this article itself in New Eastern Outlook, all of the sources that I cited. So let me just begin. U.S. President Donald Trump has recently sent a letter to Iran's leadership, providing it with a 2-month deadline regarding a new nuclear deal. This after President Trump, during his first term in office in 2018, unilaterally and baselessly withdrew from the previous what was called the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, also known as the Iran nuclear deal, and as the U.S. builds up military forces as a direct threat to Iran's government, and as the U.S. bombs Yemen, as the U.S. encourages and backs terrorists in Syria to wipe out what is left of any sort of ally to Iran, and as the U.S. continues to arm and back Israel, who is waging various proxy wars for the U.S. Against Lebanon, obviously against the Palestinians, bombing Syria, having attacked Yemen, and even Iran directly, and Israel, who will play a key role in any upcoming war with Iran. Ideally, the United States would like someone else to fight this war for it. Israel is a prime candidate, and we see news articles like this following the publishing of this article for New Eastern Outlook. U.S. deploys additional THAAD battery in Israel amid regional tensions because they are preparing to provoke a war and then absorb the reaction from Iran, which will be the use of its strategic long-range missile systems. While President Trump has suggested drastic measures may be applied if Iran doesn't meet the deadline, neither he nor anyone in his administration, or anyone else for that matter, has explained under what authority the U.S. has created this deadline, with what authority it intends to enforce it with, or how the threat of this war of aggression differs from the long line of U.S. wars of aggression President Trump campaigned for office vowing to end. And if we remember the first 4 years of President Trump's presidency, his previous administration, this is all he did, was continue every single war that was handed to him and attempt to provoke additional wars and prepare the grounds for additional wars. The conflict in Ukraine, for example. The assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, that was an act of war that was only averted by Iran's restraint, not America's. The Trump administration is posing as if its primary motivation is to prevent Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons as part of a wider narrative regarding U.S. leadership in maintaining peace and stability worldwide. We hear many people claiming that the Trump administration wants to withdraw the U.S. from the unipolar world order that it itself created. It's no longer interested in being a global hegemon, but the very fact that the U.S. is still pursuing this otherwise irrational, indefensible conflict with Iran tells you they have not given up on it. They are doubling down on it. In reality, this most recent escalation is part of a wider U.S. policy spanning multiple presidential administrations aimed at dismantling Iran's network of allies across the region, isolating Iran before pursuing regime change operations against Iran itself. This is all about eliminating any nation with an independent foreign and domestic policy. The U.S. wants to exercise hegemony over the entire planet, including the Middle East, which includes nations like Iran who refuse to submit to the United States. That is what this is really about. It has nothing to do with any genuine fear of Iran obtaining and using nuclear weapons. And I'll get to why that is in just a moment. With the removal of a sovereign Iran in the Middle East, the U.S. can advance a decade-spanning agenda of establishing and maintaining primacy both over the Middle East as well as beyond it, an agenda that has served in actuality as the single greatest threat to peace and stability worldwide. And of course, I'm talking about this. This has been ongoing since the end of World War II, perhaps even before the World Wars. This was from the New York Times, 1992. U.S. strategy plan calls for ensuring no rivals develop. They're talking about eliminating any peer or near peer adversary or rival or competitor. And it's laid out in detail here. And this has continued regardless of who is in the White House, regardless of who controls Congress. That is America's foreign policy. Everything else follows from that. They will not tolerate a strong, independent Russia or a strong, independent China, and certainly not a strong, independent Iran. And most certainly, they will not allow these independent nations to work together to undermine unipolarism, to make way for multipolarism, which is what is happening, and this is what the United States is fighting against. And again, regardless of whether it is Joe Biden who's in the White House or Donald Trump who is in the White House, it is the same agenda, which is why we are watching President Trump continue everything that he was handed from the Biden administration. And a lot of people are saying, why is the Trump administration doing this? He promised this, he promised that. He was telling you what you wanted to hear to get your support, just like every other politician in human history has ever done. And now he's doing what he wants and what the people who actually control him and tell him what his policies are, that's what he's actually now doing, not what he promised you. And this is what he did the first 4 years he was in office. So I have no idea why anyone is surprised about this at all. Now, under a section titled, "If Real Iranian Nuclear Weapons Would Be Rational, Not Radical," it should be noted that the U.S. is the only nation on Earth in human history to use nuclear weapons against another nation twice. Japan. At the end of World War II, Japan was completely defeated. They had one capital ship left in their entire fleet. They had no capacity at all in any shape, form, or way to threaten the United States. The U.S. dropped 2 nuclear bombs on Japan. It was a message. It was the perceived comeuppance of this non-white nation challenging U.S. hegemony over Asia Pacific on the other side of the planet from where the U.S. is actually located. And it's not that the Japanese were blameless. They were building an empire too. This was about 2 empires fighting over nations, territory, and influence that were unwarranted for both of them. But the U.S. dropped these nuclear weapons as a demonstration of power, not out of necessity. Throughout post-World War II history, so a lot of people will argue with me on that. They're just plain wrong. Look at where Japan was even at the beginning of World War II. It was obvious they were going to lose the war before it even began. And then toward the end of it, they were so utterly annihilated, there was never going to be a need for a U.S. invasion of the mainland. Everything was destroyed. And the Japanese had already surrendered. The U.S. just didn't like their terms, so they dropped 2 nuclear bombs on them. So a lot of people will argue about that. And then post-World War II history, something that very few people are aware of, the U.S. has considered using nuclear weapons again, including against North Korea, China, Vietnam, and even Afghanistan. So it's not just this one-off incident long ago. The temptation to use nuclear weapons by the United States has persisted from then all the way until now. So let's just look at some of the examples I cited. None of these are alternative media or anti-war publications. This is all mainstream media. How the Korean War almost went nuclear in 1950, Harry Truman had decided whether to use B-29s to drop atomic bombs. Okay, how about this one from CNN? U.S. military considered using nuclear weapons against China in 1958. Taiwan Strait crisis, leaked documents show. Again, this ties all the way to today. Taiwan is part of China. International law recognizes it as such. The U.S. officially recognizes Taiwan as part of China, but it's in the fashion of double dealing, so synonymous with the U.S. government. They encourage separatism in Taiwan. They speak to the world as if Taiwan is somehow independent, despite officially recognizing it as part of China. And they have gone to war in the past over it. They have stationed thousands of U.S. troops on Taiwan. So this has been a constant process of threatening Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan that continues until this very day. Let's look at some other examples here. This is from the New York Times. U.S. general considered nuclear response in Vietnam War cables show. So again, over and over again, every time the U.S. Sees limits to its unwarranted, unprovoked wars of aggression abroad, the desire, the temptation to use nuclear weapons is there. That's not it. Even more recent than that. Haaretz, again, Israeli media, pro-American, pro-Western media. U.S. considered using nukes against Afghanistan after 9/11. An aide to the former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder says the Bush administration really played through all possibilities. Afghanistan, using nuclear weapons on Afghanistan. This, combined with a long history of conventional wars of aggression, makes the U.S. the most dangerous nuclear-armed nation on Earth. Its belligerence a key factor in driving nations like China and North Korea to develop and expand their nuclear programs in the first place. So it wasn't as if China, North Korea, or even Iran, all of these nations said, we want nuclear weapons so that we can menace the world with them. They are making these weapons. They are pursuing this technology and all kinds of other forms of deterrence in reaction specifically to global spanning U.S. aggression. Regarding Iran specifically, the U.S. has created a decade-spanning national security threat to Tehran, including regime change in 1953 as part of Operation Ajax. And again, this is from the CIA's official website, cia.gov. This is a whole document, 139 pages, about the U.S. Operation Ajax aimed at overthrowing the sovereign government of Iran. Again, a nation on the other side of the planet. It has nothing to do with anything even remotely America's actual legitimate business. This is the U.S. playing modern day empire. There are also decades of economic sanctions meant to strangle Iran's economy, crush its population, its civilian population, to create discontent and division among the Iranians. The sponsoring of armed opposition groups inside Iran, including listed terrorist organizations, and I have covered this for many years. The Mujahideen al-Khaliq, also known as MEK, Trump allies visit throws light on secretive Iranian opposition group. And if you read through this, MEK are terrorists. They were listed as terrorists by the US, and those connected to the first Trump administration were lobbying for them while they were listed as terrorists. And then under the Obama administration, they were delisted as a terrorist organization, just to show you the continuity of agenda, the bipartisan support for this foreign policy. Has nothing to do with Republican or Democrat, right or left. There is one agenda, and everyone in office serves it. They just serve it with a layer of political rhetoric to play to different target audiences within U.S. politics, within and across the U.S. population, as well as backing proxy wars against Iran, most notably the deadly 8-year Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s, as well as proxy wars against Iranian allies, arraying not just Israel, but also Al-Qaeda, the self-proclaimed Islamic State, against Lebanese-based Hezbollah, Syria, Iranian-friendly militias in Iraq, as well as Ansar Allah in Yemen. So the U.S. wages proxy war against both Iran and its allies. The U.S. wages direct war against Iran and its allies in a number of ways. The U.S. has also invaded and destroyed nations bordering Iran to the east, that would be Afghanistan, and to the west, that would be Iraq. And that began with Afghanistan in 2001, then Iraq beginning in 2003. U.S. forces remain in Iraq to this day as not just a menace to the people of Iraq and their future, but also neighboring nations, including Iran. Were Iran pursuing nuclear weapons, it would be more rational than radical, a response to U.S. military aggression that has ravaged the Middle East for decades and decades, and has openly and constantly threatened Iran itself. And again, for no conceivable legitimate reason. Despite Iran's status as a signatory of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, the The United States, through serial acts of military aggression against non-nuclear armed states, has created a geopolitical environment voiding the core objectives of the treaty. The world cannot eliminate nuclear weapons if the US is committed to creating threats requiring nuclear deterrence. So for those waving around the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, address the United States and the conditions it has created worldwide that are forcing nations to ignore that treaty and acquire nuclear deterrence. The US is the sole factor obstructing the Non-Proliferation Treaty and a non-nuclear future for this world. The United States and no one else. What's even more telling are the conclusions reached by US policymakers themselves amid the pages of papers and reports published over the years used to guide US decision-making regarding Iran itself and the wider Middle East, including the possibility of Iran obtaining nuclear weapons and the certainty they would be used defensively, not offensively, threatening only the continuation of US interference and that of its proxies in the region. In other words, there are US policy papers that have been published over many years talking about Iran obtaining nuclear weapons and recognizing that the only threat Iran would pose if it obtained nuclear weapons would be the reality that the US would no longer be able to act with impunity in the Middle East, which it shouldn't be doing in the first place, and the fact that regime change in Iran would be infinitely more difficult if they had nuclear weapons, which again is something the US shouldn't be attempting in the first place. Among these papers is the Rand Corporation's 2009 Dangerous But Not Omnipotent reports. This one here. And again, this will be in the video description below, and you can read through this entire paper. And again, who commissioned this report? Rand Corporation publishes a lot of reports. You have to look at who has commissioned them and how important these reports may or may not be. You know, people will say, well, the Rand Corporation published this report, and yes, it makes US foreign policy look really bad. It obviously insinuates that there is continuity of agenda and no president is ever going to come into office and change it. But they also wrote this report that talks about everyone holding hands and making world peace. Look at who funded it, sponsored it, commissioned it, and then look at how it plugs into reality. There are reports that Rand Corporation publishes that are just busy work, or as part of perception management. These are reports that filter through to the mainstream media, meant to convince the public that the US wants to do this rather than that. And the way you sort them out is by looking at what the US is actually doing. And if the US is going through one policy paper, checking off every single point laid out in it, that is a policy paper that is actually guiding policy. And if there's another policy report about the US contributing to world peace, not even a single point in that paper has been implemented, then you know that that is for perception management. It's very simple. So anyway, this report about Iran, published all the way back in 2009, this is what it says. The Rand Corporation: Iran's strategy is largely defensive, but with some offensive elements. Iran's strategy of protecting the regime against internal threats, deterring aggression, safeguarding the homeland if aggression occurs, and extending influence is in large part a defensive one that also serves some aggressive tendencies when coupled with expressions of Iranian regional aspirations. It is in part a response to US policy pronouncements and posture in the region, of course, obviously. And they're admitting this, especially since the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. The Iranian leadership takes very seriously the threat of invasion, given the open discussion in the United States of regime change, speeches defining Iran as part of the axis of evil, which continues to this day under the Trump administration, and efforts by US forces to secure base access in states surrounding Iran. It's essentially the US was invading, mass murdering millions of people in nations surrounding Iran, and openly talking about invading and destroying Iran itself. So it's not as if Iran is imagining this. And they are admitting this in this Rand Corporation paper, funded by the interests that are actually driving US foreign and domestic policy spanning decades and decades. Regarding nuclear weapons specifically, the same report would state, others have argued that Iran will seek to challenge the prevailing orthodoxies on deploying, posturing, and targeting nuclear weapons, believing that the mere acquisition of the bomb, or even nuclear technology itself, will be sufficient psychological deterrent. So they're saying Iran would be happy just to have the ability to build a bomb, not even build one, but just the ability to do it to serve as a deterrent, so that they don't actually have nuclear weapons. This is an extremely rational, measured, probably too measured, and possibly naive in a way. But that's what they are admitting the Iranian government is thinking. So it's not a psychotic, ideologically driven, bloodthirsty regime looking for world conquest and acquiring and using nuclear weapons toward that end. They're looking for a deterrent against obvious and constant U.S. aggression threatening their very existence. Press statements, writings in military journals, and other glimpses into Iranian thinking on this issue appear to support the conclusion that Iran regards nuclear weapons as a powerful psychological asset but poor war-fighting tools. In other words, they're not looking to use them. They simply want them, or at least the capability to acquire them, to deter U.S. aggression and the aggression of U.S. proxies in the region, including Israel. The report would also state the actual military components of this deterrent strategy include, most obviously, the drive for an indigenous enrichment capability and a potential nuclear weapon, short and medium-range ballistic missiles, asymmetric warfare and terrorism, and popular mobilization to defend the homeland should an invasion occur. While this may appear to Western observers as a push for hegemony, Tehran likely sees it as a multi-layer form of strategic defense that extends deep into the enemy's camp and encompasses a variety of political, military, and economic levers. Because Iran looked at Iraq, which had a large conventional army that crumbled in the face of U.S. military aggression. They looked at Afghanistan, that had no conventional army and really nothing to speak of in terms of a cohesive national defense, and it crumbled in the face of U.S. military aggression. And they fought a protracted guerrilla war against the U.S., eventually overtaxing the U.S. And when the U.S. found itself overextended, they decided to cut their occupation of Afghanistan and commit resources elsewhere. And so they're looking at all of that and they're thinking to themselves, what is the best way to defend Iran against U.S. aggression in and around the region? And so this is why they have picked these tools to do so. The report commissioned by the U.S. Air Force reveals Iran's existing strategic weapons, including long-range missiles and possibly biological and chemical weapons, are used as a deterrence, not as offensive weapons. The report notes that these weapons remain under the control of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which has prevented these weapons from proliferating into the hands of other state or non-state actors. Since 2009, when the report was written, Iran has developed its strategic long-range missile arsenal even further. Following 2024 Israeli strikes on an Iranian consulate in Syria and an Israeli standoff missile strike on Iran itself, Iran demonstrated tremendous restraint in the use of these missiles, confirming the conclusions of the RAND Corporation's paper that Iran is far from a radical regime Western governments, including the current Trump administration and media, depict it as. The RAND Corporation assumed that any nuclear weapons developed by Iran would likewise be used purely as a deterrence, falling under the control of the IRGC or a similar organization to ensure they continue to serve that purpose. In other words, serve as a deterrent and not fall into the hands of groups that would use or abuse them in the wrong way, that did not suit or serve Iranian objectives of deterring aggression against Iran. Provoking war with Iran specifically because Iran prefers peace. So this is another section of the article that I wrote, and I'm going to address the Brookings Institution paper that I talk about very often since it was published in 2009. Another report published the same year by the Brookings Institution titled Which Path to Persia not only confirmed the RAND Corporation's conclusions that Iran sought to avoid conflict with the US and even Israel, it went as far as suggesting the US would need to goad Iran into a conflict to provoke the type of large-scale conflict necessary to diminish Iranian strategic capabilities and even lead to regime change in Iran, in Tehran itself. At one point, the Brookings Institution paper would explain, this is the paper right here, and again, the link to this will be in the video description below. It is 170 pages long. I've gone over it many, many times, and it outlines the entire policy of aggression and regime change aimed at Iran. And if you read this, you will see that this policy has been pursued by every single US administration, starting with the Obama administration, actually starting under the previous Bush administration, continuing throughout the first Trump administration, 4 years of Biden, and continuing eagerly under this current Trump administration. Do you remember earlier when I was talking about the Mujahideen al-Khaliq and members of the Trump administration lobbying for this US-listed terrorist organization and how ultimately the Obama administration delisted MEK? Would you be surprised if in this 2009 paper, the Mujahideen al-Khaliq got their own section right here, and they talk all about how they killed Americans, which is why they were listed as a terrorist organization, and they explain how successful they have been as a tool to undermine and destabilize Iran, and then they talk about Washington would need to remove it from the list of foreign terrorist organizations to utilize it even further. And then that is exactly what both the Obama and the Trump administration worked toward doing. And it now is delisted and used against Iran as one of many terrorist organizations. So this paper would go as far as saying it would be far more preferable if the United States could cite an Iranian provocation as justification for airstrikes before launching them. Clearly, the more outrageous, the more deadly, and the more unprovoked the Iranian action, the better off the United States would be. Of course, it would be very difficult for the United States to goad Iran into such a provocation without the rest of the world recognizing this game, which would then undermine it. They're admitting that Iran does not want to carry out an act of military aggression for no reason, just because it's an unhinged regime as the West often depicts it as. They're admitting that they would have to provoke Iran into acting, and then they would need to depict Iran as acting unprovoked. And they're saying that it is a game that they are playing with Iran. And this illustrates who the actual problem is. It is the United States. It is the US picking this fight. And now that the Trump administration has taken this policy and is eagerly advancing it, it is the Trump administration now creating the problem, driving the problem, and attempting to convince the public that somehow it is Iran's fault. The paper continues. It says, one method that would have some possibility of success would be to ratchet up covert regime change efforts in the hopes that Tehran would retaliate overtly or even semi-overtly, which could then be portrayed as an unprovoked act of Iranian aggression. So they're talking about provoking Iran, doing illegal, aggressive, unhinged things to threaten Iran, and then when Iran reacts to it, depict Iran as acting unprovoked. And they have done this over and over and over again. The mainstream corporate media plays a role in depicting it as such, and even so-called alternative media. You will see certain platforms claiming to be alternative media, which are actually cognitive infiltration operations, also trying to depict Iran as the problem and President Trump as just reacting to this irrational, horrible regime that ultimately threatens all Americans because it's foreign, it's Islamic, they're brown, and so obviously a threat to so many Americans who believe that is what threatens the United States, apparently unaware of the fact that it's Washington that is the biggest threat to America and the American people. The use of a deal to depict the US as seeking diplomacy, the US itself would then sabotage and cite the failure of as a pretext to increase economic and military pressure on Iran, was also explained in detail. Remember, this is a 2009 paper. They talked about creating a deal with Iran to make the US appear interested in diplomacy. They would deliberately sabotage it. They would blame the failure of the deal on Iran, and then they would use it to ratchet up both economic and eventually military pressure on Iran, which is exactly what the US then did. The Obama administration signed the Iran nuclear deal, and they half-heartedly implemented it. And then the Trump administration unilaterally and without any evidence or any real explanation at all just walked away from it, blamed Iran, and then ratcheted up pressure. So literally everything that was published in this 2009 report has been put into actual policy by subsequent administrations. Again, regardless of whether they're Democrat or Republican, left, right, doesn't matter. They answer to these unelected corporate financier interests that fund the Brookings Institution, the Rand Corporation, and so many other think tanks out there. They don't answer to the American people. They are manipulating the American people. They're trying to convince the American people that they work for them, while in fact they work for these unelected interests that are using, exploiting, and threatening the American people. So it says, in a similar vein, any military operation against Iran will be likely very unpopular around the world and require the proper international context, both to ensure the logistical support the operation would require and to minimize the blowback from it. The best way to minimize international opprobrium and maximize support, however grudging or covert, is to strike only when there is a widespread conviction that the Iranians were given, but then rejected a superb offer or deal, if you will. One so good that only a regime determined to acquire nuclear weapons and acquire them for the wrong reasons would turn it down. Now, they've already admitted that they only want nuclear weapons as a means of defense against admitted U.S. aggression surrounding Iran in the region. So this is part of the lie. They admit that they are telling that Iran wants these nuclear weapons for all the wrong reasons. They know that's a lie. They admit that it's a lie, but it is a lie they want to convince the world of. And hence the nuclear deal under the Obama administration and then the Trump administration walking away from it. Under those circumstances, so this is still the Brookings Institution talking, the United States or Israel could portray its operations as taken in sorrow, not anger, and at least some in the international community would conclude that the Iranians brought it on themselves by refusing a very good deal. So you see the game the U.S. is playing, and it is a game now being played, presided over by the current Trump administration. President Trump played his role in this game that the U.S. is playing and in endangering global stability in the process during his first 4 years in office. And of course, the Obama administration did so for 8 years, and the Biden administration did so for 4 years. This is the point I'm trying to make. You have people who say, well, if Kamala Harris won, everything would be much worse. No, things would be exactly the same. The only thing that would have changed are the lies that are being told to you for why we're doing the exact same thing that we've been doing, regardless of who is in the White House. At one point, the Brookings experts worried that even with a direct U.S. or Israeli strike on Iran, Iran might still not respond, giving a pretext for wider and more destructive conflict with Iran. So this is what the Brookings Institution actually worried about. It says it would not be inevitable that Iran would lash out violently in response to an American air campaign, but no American president should blithely assume that it would not. Because many Iranian leaders would likely be looking to emerge from the fighting in as advantageous a strategic position as possible, and because they would likely calculate that playing the victim would be their best route to that goal, they might well refrain from such retaliatory missile attacks. And you can see that there have been incidences where Iran was within its right to strike back at the U.S., and they pulled their punches, where the U.S. and Israel struck at Iran, and Iran pulled its punches. Those two missile salvos launched at Israel were pulled punches. Iran is capable of inflicting much greater damage on Israel with its missile arsenal. They pulled their punches specifically for this reason. They are rational. They want to defend themselves. They realize they're being set up. They realize the United States is trying to draw them into a trap and is putting pressure on them to leap into this trap, and they are doing everything within their power to avoid it. These documents not only reveal consistent U.S. strategy of regime change, covert action, and military pressure, they also admit that the threat Iran poses is linked more to impeding U.S. impunity in the Middle East rather than any real national security threat to either the U.S. itself or its proxies, including Israel. Iran is not an inherent threat to Israel. It is only a threat to Israel because Israel is a proxy of the U.S. being used to attack and goad Iran, as U.S. policy papers have said for years and years now. Even as U.S. policy papers like those published by the Rand Corporation and the Brookings Institution lay out plans to target, undermine, and overthrow Iran's political order, it is admitted within their pages that the very pretexts cited by US administrations regarding Iranian nuclear ambitions or the threat Iran poses to the US and the rest of the world are deliberate and malicious fabrications. They are admitting it. If you read the papers, it gets even worse than that. It's 170 pages of them admitting that they are lying to the public. They are lying to the global international order, and they are doing this deliberately. The threat the current Trump administration claims Iran and its allies pose to the region and the world are likewise fabrications and a continuation of this long-standing US policy. This is not President Trump fighting the deep state, but, oh, Iran is also bad and he needs to fight Iran. No, this is President Trump serving the deep state while pretending to fight it and then tricking Americans into believing that somehow fighting Iran is in their best interest rather than the deep state's best interests. Avoiding war requires addressing the US as the actual threat to peace. So this is the final section of my article. If the US genuinely wanted to avoid another catastrophic war in the Middle East, as President Trump campaigned on, ending all of these wars that he blames the Biden administration on, the Obama administration before that. If he really wanted to end these wars, this is what he would do, but he's not doing it. So this is how you know he's lying to you. It would address the primary cause of regional conflict in the Middle East, US policy itself. The US would end its support of proxies like Israel, waging Washington's endless proxy wars against its neighbors, and America's own illegal military aggression and economic sanctions against Iran and its allies, and work with the region as partners rather than invaders and occupiers. The U.S. still literally occupies illegally several countries in the Middle East, including Iraq and Syria. To this day, they still occupy these nations illegally. For those imagining the U.S. under the Trump administration seeks peace with Russia and Ukraine, the very fact that the US is openly seeking to target Iran with military aggression demonstrates its desire to not only collapse Iran, but to collapse the multipolar world order Iran serves as one of several major pillars holding it up. Russia, China, and India are three other major pillars the US would seek to bring multipolarism crashing down upon with the destruction of Iran. A war on Iran, an unwarranted, unjustified war by their own admission, is a war on Russia and China and India and every other nation interested in and investing in multipolarism. In this context, US peace negotiations with Russia are simply a means of pausing a proxy war the US has been losing for 3 years to defeat the key powers of multipolarism in detail rather than all at once. The US is incapable of fighting Russia, Iran, and China all at the same time. So we want to put a pin for now in the Ukraine proxy war on Russia, a war the US is fighting against Russia, even right now under the Trump administration. Everything Ukraine does is enabled by the US. Without the US enabling it, it would not be happening. So this is the US fighting Russia through Ukraine. It is not mediating peace between Ukraine and Russia. The US started this war, they engineered every aspect of it. They have not just politically captured Ukraine, they have militarily and institutionally captured Ukraine. The intelligence agencies of Ukraine are under the control of the United States. Its military is under the control of the United States. Every drone strike it carries out inside Russian territory is enabled by US intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, targeting acquisition, information. It would not happen without it. And so when President Trump proposes an energy infrastructure ceasefire and Russia agrees to it and Ukraine continues carrying out strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, that is the US striking at Russian energy infrastructure. Russia knows this. So just playing along while continuing their war of attrition against Ukrainian forces. Because the US will continue speeding toward conflict in the Middle East, putting at risk multipolarism worldwide, only through cooperation across the emerging multipolar world order can the conditions be created that first inhibit US aggression abroad, then isolate the US geopolitically within its borders until the special interests driving current US policy are displaced by interests prepared to cooperate with the rest of the world rather than impose themselves upon it. I've talked about this many times before, and this is what is happening. Multipolarism is trying to incrementally displace, replace different aspects of the US-led unipolar world order. And what this is doing, and we can see this happening, it's isolating these corrupt, uncompetitive corporate monopolies the US has lorded over the planet with for decades and decades. They're being confined to the US and its spheres of influence because it's not able to victimize and exploit all of these other regions of the world. It's turning on its supposed allies, and it will turn inward and begin eating the American people themselves. Hopefully, those special interests will collapse, giving way to more constructive special interests within the US who are pragmatic, who put purpose above profit, want to serve the best interests of the American people, realizing that is the best way to serve their own best interests in a sustainable manner, and also then apply that to foreign policy, working with and cooperating with the rest of the world rather than trying to impose itself upon the rest of the world. This is what separates the US system and its foreign policy from, say, Russia or China's system of economics domestically and their foreign policy around the globe. This US posture towards Iran, this growing tension, the growing threat of war, is just another fact establishing indisputably that the Trump administration is only advancing continuity of agenda. It is not fighting the deep state, it is working for it. It told Americans what they wanted to hear, to con them into giving this system, these interests, more time to continue doing what they want rather than what they owe the American people. And the more people that wake up to this and put upward pressure on the US government within the US and around the globe, the more difficult this will be, as pragmatic solutions across multipolarism also exert pressure on the US, on US aggression, confining it, collapsing it, and hopefully replacing it with something better. So we will have to keep a close eye on all of this. Until then, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. In the video description below are all of the links that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up for whatever reason, feel free to skip them. They're not helping me out at all. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also through Patreon. The links to those will be in the video description below. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, donations month to month, or if you have no resources to spare and you're just helping share my work, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you. And as always, thank you for watching.